It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. London firearms officers handing in their weapons and considering their futures after one of their colleagues was charged with murder over the shooting of Chris Cabba. The legacy of COVID. A new study finds patients who required hospital treatment are far more likely to suffer major organ damage. Rishi Sunak disbands a task force set up to boost home energy efficiency just days after relaxing the UK's net zero targets. Clean up our beaches. The protesters demanding an end to more than 800 sewage discharges every single day. 16 wins in a row. Six Nations champions Ireland beat the holders South Africa at the Rugby World Cup. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's in the press preview from 10:30. Hello, a very good evening. The Metropolitan Police says a number of firearms officers have handed in their weapons and are considering their futures after one of their colleagues was charged with murder over the shooting of Chris Cabba. The 24-year-old was killed in September last year, and the officer accused of his murder appeared at the Old Bailey this week. It's led to a growing number of officers considering their position this weekend. And the Met Commissioner says he understands their concerns. Well, our correspondent Sajid Chowdhury is at Scotland Yard this evening. So what are the police saying tonight?
Well, the firearms officers and senior officials and the Met Police Commander had already been having meetings amid worries that they'll be judged. The decisions they take while on duty will be judged. They're worried about how those decisions will be judged. And as you say, this follows the decision by the CPS to charge a firearms officer with the murder of Chris Cabba. And tonight the Met say that a number of officers have stepped back from armed duties and that number has risen over the last 48 hours. In a statement, the Met described them as having genuinely held concerns. And I'll read out a bit of that statement to you now. It says many are worried about how the decision, that's the decision by the CPS to charge an officer with murder, impacts on them, on their colleagues and on their families. They are concerned that it signals a shift in the way the decisions they take in the most challenging circumstances will be judged. A number of officers have taken the decision to step back from armed duties while they consider their position. That number has increased over the past 48 hours. Well, the statement doesn't indicate how many officers have taken that step back, but we do know that Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, has said that in recent days he has met with 70 firearms officers who operate all across London. And no doubt they'll be monitoring the situation very closely and exploring all contingency options because the force, of course, has really significant firearms capabilities. But it has assured us tonight that there are armed officers operating in communities across London, as well as at high security sites like in Parliament, at embassy buildings and, of course, at airports.
Yeah, and New Scotland Yard, thank you. Researchers say people who have long COVID and those who are admitted to hospital because of the virus are more likely to suffer damage to their major organs. Scans have revealed that those patients have more abnormalities in the brain, kidneys and lungs than those who haven't had COVID. But it's hoped that findings could help develop better treatments in future, as Adele Robinson reports.
I can't even remotely recognise that girl now. She's completely gone. I've lost my identity completely.
The debilitating effects of long COVID are still unravelling, just like the lives of some of those affected. Tanisha was a tennis prodigy before developing the condition.
Losing your independence, your identity, your joy, everything overnight, it's not something anyone can prepare you for.
Now, new research into long-term damage from COVID suggests it can cause organ abnormalities, as it has for Tanisha.
I had heart inflammation and sinus tachycardia. My lungs, I've got mild reduction of gas transfer and they're trying to rule out blood clots in my lungs. My liver, some enzymes went a little bit haywire and they think it might be liver inflammation. My uterus is also inflamed. My brain, they said, is working below capacity, and that's not how I was before. Like, this is just all stemming from long COVID.
Tanisha welcomes the new study to better understand long COVID, a study which saw MRI scans carried out on hospitalised COVID patients, showing nearly a third had damage to organs 5 months later. Lung injuries were almost 14 times higher than in people who had not had the virus. Abnormalities in the brain were 3 times higher and kidneys 2 times higher.
You can see that there are these white intensities in the white matter of the brain of this person who was previously hospitalised with COVID-19.
Leading the research was Dr. Betty Rahman, who said those in the older age groups were more likely to suffer long-term damage.
On average, people with multi-organ abnormalities were older than those without multi-organ abnormalities. So they were on average 59 years old, 7 years older than those without multi-organ MRI abnormalities. So that appears to be a risk for ongoing damage.
Earlier this year, it was estimated that 1.9 million people were experiencing self-reported long COVID. And with the virus still circulating, there are calls from medical professionals for more research.
Those people who've had them very early on in the pandemic and have been suffering for a couple of years and more now, whether this is something that will then spontaneously resolve over the forthcoming months and years, or whether it would need an intervention. The fact that we're seeing people with persistence of symptoms 2 years and longer suggests to me that there would need to be an intervention.
One limit was that researchers couldn't be sure some organ damage didn't predate COVID, but it offers more insight into what has become for many a life-debilitating condition. Adele Robinson, Sky News.
Just days after easing the UK's net zero targets, Rishi Sunak has disbanded a group set up to accelerate home insulation and boiler upgrades. The axing of the Home Energy Efficiency Task Force comes as MPs call on the Prime Minister to do more to help struggling households this winter. Wholesale energy prices have fallen since last year, but people's bills could actually increase. Here's Fraser Maud.
I tend to stay out longer, because I know if I come home, then I've got to heat the place.
Winter might not be here just yet, but it is coming. And for thousands of people, so too are concerns about how they'll be keeping warm. For music lover Mark Watson, a 63-year-old former commercial artist in Whitley Bay, the £400 payment to households last winter made a huge difference. He'd like to see that return, but only for those who really need it.
They're not helping folk who need help, rather than giving the money to everybody, to people who don't really need it. And it should be targeted to people who do need it and give them more.
It's not just Mark who thinks the government could do more. A group of MPs is calling for support for under-pressure households ahead of what they see as an inevitable new energy crisis this winter.
Last year, we saw winter deaths increase by 50%. And whilst the government did do things, 6.6 million people are in fuel poverty. There will need to be some sort of energy support scheme. It probably needs to be more targeted this time. More targeted means more complicated, so it means they need to be getting on with it now.
A report from the Energy Security and Net Zero Committee says that while wholesale energy prices have fallen significantly, many households will still be paying the same costs this winter, or even more. That's partly because the government isn't subsidising bills by up to £67 like it did last winter, and because the standing charge, a fixed daily amount customers pay regardless of how much energy is used, has gone up by 65% in less than 5 years. The government says there is almost £40 billion of support already available through the Warm Home Discount and the Energy Price Guarantee, but campaigners say more is needed, especially as costs rise elsewhere.
There is no blanket scheme helping all households in the country anymore. There is some targeted support, but that is a cost of living payment, which has often been eaten up already by the wider cost of living crisis.
Regulator Ofgem says it expects suppliers to treat their customers with compassion and stick to the rules, requiring them to be proactive in identifying, advising and supporting those who might be struggling. For thousands of people like Mark, though, this could be another winter of choosing between heating and eating. Fraser Maud, Sky News, Whitley Bay.
The autumn conference season is underway and there's a good chance it will be the last one before the next general election. The Liberal Democrats are kicking things off on the South Coast with party leader Sir Ed Davey arriving in Bournemouth in a convoy of bicycles. Our political correspondent Rob Powell reports.
Ringing in conference season, the Lib Dems advancing under their own steam again.
Come on, 1, 2, 3,
Spirits high as members descend on the Bournemouth seaside.
We've had some fantastic by-election results, winning in Conservative heartlands and our council results across the country. And I think it's really clear that in many parts of the country, to beat the Conservatives, to get them out of government, people need to vote Liberal Democrat.
The party is meeting on home turf. They swept to power in the council elections in May, propelled by local and national Tory turmoil. When the general election comes round, similar success could leave the party in a powerful position.
If you like what we're offering, vote for us. If enough of us get elected, it puts us in a position to then go to other parties and say, if you want us to support you in some way or another, this is what we want.
But it's still a long wait for voting day, with plenty left to convince.
Yeah, but they're probably better than the other two.
So sort of like a
Less
protest
of two
vote.
evils, yeah.
Bit of a waste of a vote, I think. I mean, there's generally two parties.
Always coming third.
2, 1. Cheesy stunts have become something of a calling card for the Lib Dems. In 4 years since the last conference, they're enjoying this gathering.
Members here believe their party's on the up. Recent wins suggest that the hangovers from the Brexit battles and the coalition years may have finally passed. Now the Lib Dems are looking towards the general election and targeting Tory seats in the home counties and more traditional strongholds here in the southwest.
And they have a track record. 30 years ago, the Christchurch by-election saw the party's biggest ever swing from the Conservatives. The defeated Tory candidate in that vote, who's now a peer and pollster, says winning across the country is a different task.
The difficulty in a general election is they have to identify which seats to go for. And classically, there is a tendency to overestimate. You need a strong campaign manager saying, these are the seats we're going to concentrate on.
Characteristically crowd-pleasing policy on the environment and the NHS will be thrashed out here in the coming days. The Tories and Labour keeping an eye on the Lib Dems once again. Rob Powell, Sky News in Bournemouth.
And Trevor Phillips will be joined by Sir Ed Davey on his show at 8:30 tomorrow morning when he takes a look at the week in politics. A man has been taken to hospital after being bitten by a dog believed to be an XL bully. The man, who is in his 40s, was attacked in south-east London yesterday and suffered injuries to his arm. The owner of the dog left the scene before police arrived. Ukraine has reportedly launched further attacks on Sevastopol in occupied Crimea a day after targeting Russia's Black Sea fleet in the port city. At least one missile struck the fleet's headquarters, with Ukraine claiming to have targeted a gathering of senior officers. Russia says one serviceman is missing. A 46-year-old woman arrested in connection with a car crash at a school in southwest London has been bailed until January next year. 2 8-year-old girls died when a Land Rover crashed into the study prep school in Wimbledon in July. When it published its new suicide prevention programme last week, the government also highlighted a rise in self-harm among children and young people. Ahead of a national investigation into NHS mental health services, Sky News has spoken to one patient who claims NHS care has done her more harm than good. A warning that our home editor Jason Farrell's report contains images of scarring from self-harm.
They want to get you in, make it look like they've helped you, and then get you discharged.
In May, we showed you a series of failings at a mental health hospital in Gloucestershire. Staff asleep on the job, patients going missing, one discharged while saying they were suicidal, then jumping off a bridge, breaking multiple bones. And we knew of one patient regularly climbing on the roof. And for the first time, that person, Nikki, has agreed to talk about her experience in Wootton Lawn Hospital.
In the last 10 years, I've been up and down off that roof using the same route to climb hundreds of times.
Nikki did it to clear her head, but also once attempted to take her life on the roof. And we know another patient who jumped off during a psychotic episode. This, and images we've been sent of staff asleep on the job, raises concerns about the level of attention being paid by staff to vulnerable patients.
And are they always falling asleep at night, or can it happen any time?
During the day, I've seen sleeping staff at lunchtime.
A whistleblower told us that agency staff were sometimes coming straight to work at Wootton Lawn, having come off shift elsewhere. And Nikki says the irregularity of agency staff means it's harder to form relationships, but there's also no consistent focus on the root problems that lead her to self-harm.
They haven't taught me a different way of coping. They haven't taught me how do I ask for help.
So, Nikki, do you mind if I ask you, why do you self-harm?
I have autism, and so I copy what other people do, and I'd copied my twin sister, who's since passed away, and that's how I'd learned originally how to self-harm.
Nikki lost her twin sister Laura to suicide after she was also a patient at Wootton Lawn. An inquest found the hospital had failed to pass on crucial information about Laura to another hospital, leading to a fatal mistake.
Since being in hospital, through other patients directly telling me, I've learned these new methods of self-harming that are more severe, have more complications. And if I hadn't been in hospital, I wouldn't have known about that.
Last week, the government launched a suicide reduction programme, noting it was on the rise among young people, along with self-harm. Clearly, focus needs to be on the care of those like Nikki most at risk. A review of her care last year found her suicide risk increased after she'd been admitted to hospital.
Each time I go into that hospital, my admission is a little bit longer each time, or there's a new method of self-harm that I've learned, and it's mentally draining. You come out of hospital thinking that there's no hope. If this is going to be my life for the next 20 years, if I'm going to be in and out of hospital and this is how they're going to treat me, and they're not going to fix the cause of my issues, then what's the point? And then you go back to thinking, what's the point in anything? What's the point in living?
In a statement, the hospital trust said, "We regret that our patient and their family are not satisfied with the services we provide. We constantly review our policies and procedures. For example, we have a range of anti-climb measures in place, and these have been reviewed and strengthened in recent months. Reports of sleeping on duty at Wootton Lawn are very rare indeed, but when these have arisen, we've taken robust action." They also say a recent recruitment drive has reduced the need for agency staff.
I am a human. I have a mum. I am a daughter. I'm a sister. My family do want me to live. And it's hard for me because there's that battle.
Do you want to live?
No. Not really. And I think that goes back to that each time I go into hospital, I lose hope.
Nikki was discharged from Wootton Lawn not long after this interview and attempted to take her life. She was saved in intensive care. I spoke to her and her stepfather a few days later over Zoom from her hospital bed.
So all these things were predictable. The family warned about it. Nikki even said she felt that she was at risk.
An independent review of her care on discharge expressed great concerns, saying they were not at all confident with her outpatient care plan.
I thought maybe the services would step in and help and make a difference, but it just seemed like they got further and further away.
Nikki is now back in Wootton Lawn, back sending me photos from the roof. The Trust says it can't comment on individual care plans due to patient confidentiality, but their focus is on safety and well-being. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
And of course, if you've been affected by anything in that report, you can call the Samaritans 116 123 or email joe@samaritans.org, the email address there. Tensions between Israel and Hezbollah are at their highest level in years. Hezbollah, the Islamist militant group that controls the area around the border in southern Lebanon, is armed and funded by Iran. Both states say the other is interfering with its territory. The Lebanese army said it fired tear gas at Israeli forces in response to smoke bomb attacks in southern Lebanon. Israel and Lebanon don't have an agreed border, but the UN patrols the boundary between the countries known as the Blue Line. From there, Sky's Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle reports.
You can't quite see the internationally recognised border from the roof we're standing on, but it is there, in amongst the bushes. It's called the Blue Line and is marked by 272 barrels painted in the light blue colours of the United Nations. The tall concrete barrier snaking over the hills belongs to Israel.
It always used to be like the green without border flag, but the fact that now they're just saying this is Hezbollah, this is like new.
The last conflict between Israel and Lebanon was in 2006, but with no armistice signed, officially the two sides remain at war.
This land here should be some military buffer zone, in theory at least. The Israelis, the IDF, argue that by Hezbollah putting their yellow flag just there and building lookout posts 100 or so yards away, well, this is a violation of the agreement with the United Nations.
Earlier this month, Israel revealed satellite images of an airstrip that it claims is being built in southern Lebanon with Iranian money.
Hezbollah have massive Iranian backing. They've been fortifying themselves and building their force since 2006 with advanced projectiles that can arrive all the way to Tel Aviv.
In April, the biggest salvo of rockets in years was fired from Lebanon into Israel. It's thought that Hamas was responsible, but acted with Hezbollah knowledge. And then in June, Hezbollah erected 2 military-style tents just south of the Blue Line, claiming that it was Lebanese territory.
It's a concern for all of us, but it's important also that our relation and our coordination with both parties exists.
So why the increased tensions and provocations now? Well, Israel is divided domestically over government plans to reform the judiciary. One theory is that Hezbollah see this as an opportunity to test Israel. Lebanon also accuses Israel of regularly flying through its airspace without permission to bomb Iranian targets in neighbouring Syria, both Hezbollah's allies. But if a new war did break out, it wouldn't be confined just to Lebanon. Hezbollah's allies, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, would almost certainly fight from Gaza and the West Bank too. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, on the Israeli-Lebanese border.
Singer Fergal Sharkey and boxer Barry McGuigan have joined calls for tougher action against water companies for dumping sewage in our waterways. Protesters say utility companies are not going far enough or fast enough in their efforts to curb sewage releases, and the punishments handed out should be much tougher, as Lisa Dowd reports.
In a seaside town famous for its oysters, they've had enough. Whitstable can't stomach the dumping of sewage.
You walk along the shore and you see a big cloud, a couple of 100 yards out off the shore. If the wind's blowing towards you, you won't have to wait very long before it's lapping up on the actual coast itself. It's disgusting.
For 30 years, we as bill payers have given every water company in the country all of the funding they ever needed to fix the sewage system. They clearly didn't spend it on the sewage system. They've made off with £72 billion worth of our money.
Around 2,000 people turned out to protest about what Southern Water is doing.
We don't go swimming anymore. I don't remember the last time we've been to the beach as a family.
It's not just us, it's obviously the marine life, it's the fear of our pets going in the water. And we all live seaside and we want to celebrate it, we want to enjoy it.
When people see about sewage on the beach and with the sea, they don't come down. And of course we need the money.
Southern Water said, "We understand the concerns being raised in Whitstable about water quality. This is why we're investing significant money and resources, optimising our assets and using innovative technology and natural solutions to divert or slow the flow of water entering our sewers and significantly reduce the use of storm overflows."
We understand there's been an investment of around £250,000 in our local wastewater treatment works. We believe that so far has reduced the amount of sewage releases into the sea by around 4, which would amount to about 2% of the total this year. It's just simply not good enough. So, yeah, we're here again. We'll be here again next year if we're not happy with the rate at which things are getting better.
Southern is not the only water company grappling with this issue. Last year, there were 100,000 sewage spills into England's an average of 800 spills. That adds up to almost 1.8 million hours. Southern spilled for more than 145,000 hours, but United Utilities spilled the longest, more than 425,000 hours last year. People are increasingly angry at the state of our coastline and rivers. In some constituencies, it's one of the defining political issues, with a general election on the horizon. Lisa Dowd, Sky News.
Well, it's been a busy day in the sport. Let's get the latest now with Chris.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
It seems like you've spent probably over a decade in a fight, and oftentimes in a fight on your own.
Yeah, look, it's not ideal, but you know, it's made me a far more resilient person. No, I can definitely say that. And sometimes you just have to take the fight on. Majority of it's been alone. But look, I don't mind that. You know what I mean? It is what it is. Like I've got my values, and people have their values, and you know they aren't always going to be the same. And the way they view me, you know, like that just comes from an uneducated person who doesn't really know too much what they're talking about.
But there's been death threats, there's been a lot of horrible things towards your family.
Of course. Yeah, like I said, like I'm quite thick-skinned. Like I'm a product of my environment and where I've come from. You know, it's a place that's very headstrong, very stubborn, like resilient, proud people, and so I'll take that all day. Like you can abuse me, like I said, it's not ideal, but look, I'll take it. But when you start bringing my children and my family, then that's crossed the line. That's a whole different ball game. I understand that people have different values from me and different beliefs. Like I respect that. Just because I don't fall on the line and honor that doesn't mean I'm being disrespectful or I hate you. All I'm asking for is to be respected of my beliefs in return. It's as simple as that. Discrimination is discrimination. It should be treated the exact same. If I can be the one that paves the way for this to stop, and for any young Irish player coming across, and you know, if it stops them from getting abuse and they feel freely do however they feel and what they believe in without the consequences, then you know, I think that'll be the ultimate goal. That'll be then. I think it'll be all worth it then.
I think the audience needs to hear about this, how this affects your family, your parents, your wife, your kids, and how they deal with it.
Yeah, over the years, my wife and especially my mother. My mother's a very anxious, worried person anyway. Yeah, it's been hard on her because, you know, as much as I can, like I said, I can take it head on and I'm whatever, do your worst, whatever to me, but you know, you sometimes you forget that there's other people, you know, who are dealing it with you, and you know, who's probably not has got the same mentality as you. So it's been quite scary for my wife, and she's got quite worried over the years, and then my mother's got quite worried over the years, and sometimes my fault where I don't kind of think about how they're feeling because I'm just like straight on the, like, you know,
wanting to react.
Defense mode, defense mode. So yeah, like it has been quite hard. It has been quite hard.
Is it tiring? Is it exhausting? It must be.
It can be. Look, and it's exhausting when you have to keep explaining yourself over and over and over. That's the tiring part. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm no angel on the side. Like I've made mistakes. Like the lockdown balaclava picture. Like that was. I regret that. I regret it in a sense because it's give people now an opportunity to see what he brings on himself. But like the thing is, and I see people all the time, I think anytime my name gets brought up, they just attach that picture to it. Yeah. And that was just bad judgment on my part. It was supposed to be a joke, and it wasn't a joke, and it turned out just to be an absolute disaster judgment call. But that happened in lockdown, which was 2020. I've been getting abuse since 22.
12.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like you have 8 years of this where you're getting it at all angles. You mess up once and it's labelled against you. It's all like, oh, just the 8 years, they don't matter anymore. They just, like, you done this, you bring it on yourself. And that's where the regret comes from.
You mentioned dark days, and I know you want to do the whole I'm strong, I can deal with a lot, but it does permeate, it does get through because you're human.
Of course, like I said, sometimes your mood will reflect. You might have a bad game and a bad result, and you're in bad form, or you might be get taken off or whatever, and then you're getting abuse on the way home, or you're getting abuse and you're already like frustrated and annoyed, and sometimes that.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Chris, thank you very much. And that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we're going to take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview. Tonight, I'm joined by journalist and author Christine Patterson and political commentator Benedict Spence. Great to see you both in the studio, talking about all the headlines on Sunday's papers, including this story on the front of the Sunday Telegraph. Axe looms over HS2 after £8 billion cost shock. Discussing that and more in a couple of minutes. Do join us.
The press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
There's a feeling amongst some commentators that it's not the most respectful timing.
I think there's a word for it, fake news.
I mean, it's wah from Harry. Delving deeper into the stories with different perspectives on tomorrow's headlines.
We really haven't seen the government getting round the table and negotiating. There are no easy answers to those questions.
The press preview delivering you tomorrow's news tonight on Sky News.
Enormous explosion has just come down. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
You either live and recover, or you die.
A very good evening. It's time for the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's papers. And tonight we'll be checking out those headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and also the political commentator Benedict Spence. Great to see you both. Very good evening. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at some of those front pages for you. Let's begin with the Sunday Telegraph, shall we, saying that the Prime Minister could be about to scrap the second half of the HS2 railway line after a shock increase to its estimated cost. Well, it's the same story on the front of The Observer. Rishi Sunak is facing a massive backlash from senior Tories over the potential U-turn. Well, the Express says the Prime Minister is considering a raft of radical policy announcements designed to put space between himself and the Labour leader as both parties eye up the looming general election. Here's your Sunday Times leading on one of those potential announcements. It says the Prime Minister is drawing up plans to slash inheritance tax. And the Sunday Mail also leading on one of Sunak's possible election plans. They say Sunak will not axe the triple lock on pensions after being warned it would be political suicide. While the Star looks at scientists who are attempting to find methane gas produced by alien life form in space. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of Sunday's papers while you watch us discussing them. And to do that tonight, I'm joined by Christina Patterson and Benedict Spence. So, lots to get through, both of you. HS2 on the front of a number of tomorrow's papers. Christina, why don't we have a look at The Observer? Their headline, Sunak pushes to axe HS2 link ahead of Tory conference taking place in Manchester. There's been a lot of talk about this over the last few days, hasn't there? Has the government dug itself into a really expensive hole and they've now got to decide whether they keep on digging or they stop digging? What do you think they should do?
Well, I think that's exactly right. They have dug themselves into a very expensive hole. What I don't understand is why all the holes we dig ourselves into in this country are quite as expensive as they turn out to be. All our infrastructure projects seem to, spiral. And I don't think other countries have such, in Europe in particular, they're just not so completely out of control. But I do think for anyone in business at the moment, life is impossible because Rishi Sunak is, someone has clearly told him, axe this, axe that, show who you are, put dividing lines between you and Starmer because they want him to, even though he's massively behind in the polls, they think this is his only chance of winning an election. But we just look like the most unstable country in Europe at the moment. We are flip-flopping all over the place. Here is Sunak cutting back the net zero targets, cutting what is meant to be our flagship infrastructure project, which is meant to be about levelling up, sort of getting north and south better connected. In fact, it was more about capacity than speed, and that's become very evident. But again, some honesty about that would have been quite helpful. So I have to say, I think that...
Is Jeremy Hunt not being honest, though, when he says that the costs are just getting out of control?
Well, I mean, I'm racking my brains to think which government has been in charge of this country for the last 13 years. And I think Jeremy Hunt might find that he has personally been in that government for, in fact, all of those 13 years. So whose fault it is that these infrastructure costs have been soaring, I don't know. Clearly some little green man running down the road.
HS2, Benedict, is saying that it's the pandemic that's partly caused it, inflation, and there have been a lot of external factors that have pushed prices up.
There are also, I mean, the thing is, when it comes to this country, you get the country you deserve. And I'm afraid, as much as anything else, it is partly the government's fault, but it is also partly the fault of numerous different competing special interests that mean that actually we have to go through all sorts of loops and holes in order to get anything built. Now, some of these are very noble things like health and safety precautions, obviously environmental policies and things that, various different boxes have to be ticked. But it's when you sort of get down into the nitty-gritty details of this and you look at how much, for example, was spent on tunnelling so as not to arouse the ire of certain landowners, so they didn't have to look at a railway going through their land, house owners and the like, that you begin to see actually where the money starts to go and the amount of money that then goes on consultancy fees and things like that. And it's not just, obviously we all know that it's not just HS2. There was the news yesterday about how much it's going to cost to renovate the House of Commons, and that's going to be 20 billion over the course of about 30 years, because it has to, everything has to be about, obviously, things like health and safety, but is this a fire hazard? Is that accessible? Is this environmentally friendly? It's so many different things, and that's before you even then get into the legal challenges. Another example, Sizewell C, a vital source of electricity for this country, now got to go back to the courts because some local people don't quite fancy it being there. And I'm afraid that's why when I say you get the country you deserve, we have such a thorough set of checks and balances on infrastructure projects in this country that it is contributing to stifling any kind of building, be it a reservoir, be it a housing estate. It's just impossible, really, to build these things on the level that you're able to in Europe or Japan, or, China's a bad example because they have a very different system of government. But Christina's right. You look at how much high-speed rail has been built in Spain, for example, since we decided we were going to build HS2. Well, they've managed to connect pretty much every major city across Spain for a fraction of the cost. But they don't really go to the same extremes that we do. And a lot of people would say that's so that people don't mess you around, that's so that corners aren't cut. That's all very noble, but that is the price you pay for being quite as thorough and quite as accommodating to everybody as we are in this country. It gets very expensive.
Yeah, OK. The government saying, interestingly, the HS2 project already well underway with spades in the ground, and our focus remains on delivering it. So we shall see what happens in coming days. Let's go to the Sunday Times. Christina, another change on the way, potentially. Rishi Sunak reviving plans to slash inheritance tax.
Yes, because 3.76% of this country is affected by inheritance tax. So why would it not be a major election winner? His ability to focus on, well, the tiny percentage of people who would benefit from this kind of thing. It just, I'm afraid it does show where the Tories' priorities lie. And by the way, I think if inheritance tax were abolished, his own daughters would save £290 million in inheritance tax. So clearly that would be very nice for them. It's been billed as the most hated tax. That seems to me unlikely, but I think that the Tories' kind of desperate focus on tax cutting, and a year ago at this point we had Liz Truss promising she was going to cut taxes. Unfortunately, what she did instead was completely wreck the economy. Their vision of tax cutting is just not shared by the British public. It is not a priority. What people want and what emerges in the polls is that people want a country that functions well. And that, at the moment, is not what we have. We have an NHS which is in a terrible state with people on strike. We have a train service that isn't functioning. It's difficult to go and get a doctor's appointment. We've had schools crumbling. Our infrastructure is collapsing. We've got people on strike. We've got, honestly, sometimes this feels like a developing world country in certain services. And I really think this idea that that everybody's top priority is to cut taxes is for the birds.
I mean, it's been a very small number of people up to now that have been affected by inheritance tax. And it is one of those great sleights of hand, this idea that people feel very angry about the idea of having to pay inheritance tax, but it's never going to really affect them. But 22% of all pensioners are now millionaires in this country, not because they worked very hard and saved very carefully, but because the values of their property have gone through the roof. And so this is actually something that is very soon, perhaps not during the life cycle of this Parliament or even Rishi Sunak's political career, but it is sooner or later, it is actually going to affect rather a lot more people than it has done in the past. So I can understand why this would be sort of a bit of red meat, certainly to Tory grassroots, because a lot of them are going to end up having to deal with this. I wouldn't have thought it would be a major priority, given that actually I would be sort of trying to look to alleviate pressures on younger people who are, I think, the most put upon, rather than pensioners or the people who are most likely to benefit from them, which are people in their 40s and 50s. Yeah. Actually, it's people in their 20s and 30s that we ought to be focusing on. But the government has got to weigh up its calculations, and it will calculate correctly that those people are broadly not likely to vote Tory at the next election, whatever the government does for them. So it's got to look at its short-term interests. Its polling is appalling. It has to try to get people out to vote rather than just have them stay at home. That's likely to be pensioners and people in their 40s and 50s and early 60s who would be most likely to benefit from this. So you can understand why. It is something that sort of, not immediately, but sooner or later is actually going to play a major part, and it is the sort of thing that I think would galvanise a lot more the Tory grassroots, who right now they don't look as if they are actually going to go over and vote for Labour. The major fear for Rishi Sunak is come the next election, and I think that is sooner than later, given the raft of policies that are being wheeled out, that those people just decide, do you know what, I've had enough of the Tories, so I'm just not going to vote, I'm just going to sit at home. He has to try to galvanise that support and try and get it out, and obviously there has to be some sort of suggestion within Tory internal polling that these policies must do that, because otherwise it doesn't make a great deal of sense why they're doing it right now.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? OK, stay where you are, if you would. We're going to take a look at some more of the front pages in a moment, including this from the Sunday Times. Former BBC bosses face fresh questions about Russell Brand. That and more after this short break.
Well, it's kind of a way to fundraise for our charity, and we thought it was a really creative way to fundraise. And basically, we've got 60 of the world's best playwrights who have annotated scripts, first edition scripts, and they've put in their thoughts, their feelings, their memories, and it's really, really exciting. They've gone back to them and written them especially, so they've taken a couple of hours of their time and they've sort of thought about why they wrote the script, what special lines meant to them, what their favourite lines are. So it's really interesting, and we were reading through them, and some of them are quite moving, and some of them are really funny. And well, Jez Butterworth's annotated script of Jerusalem was one of my favourites, because he not only annotated it, but he stuck in some props from the original production. So you've got like fake money in there, and some fake cocaine in there, and some lighter that Mark Rylance used. So it's really interesting. So that was one of my favourites. It's a piece of history. It's never been done before. So people who are into theatre, or just anyone who likes those films or those plays, it's like having a piece of history in your living room.
So tell us about the work. Where will the proceeds of this auction go to?
They go to Good Chance Theatre. We're a theatre company who work with refugee artists, and we were founded in 2015 in the Calais Jungle Refugee and Migrant Camp.
And where are you based now?
We're based in London, but we work all over the world with artists from all over the world.
Fantastic. And when's the auction?
It's happening right now, so you could bid on it right now. And it finishes on the 6th of October.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Hello again, part 2 of the press preview. Christina and Benedict are still with us. Let's turn to Ukraine, shall we, Benedict? President Biden has told President Zelensky that he's going to supply these long-range missiles.
He will. The Long-Range Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, these are mounted on the back of a vehicle, and they have a range of 300 kilometres, so you can imagine that they are very useful if you're fighting what is quite nasty attritional trench warfare all along the front to be able to hit your enemy quite far behind or indeed from a long distance away. These are the sorts of weapons that Ukraine has been wanting to get their hands on for a very long time. They're state-of-the-art, they're incredibly powerful, but also, and this is part of the reason why I think the US has actually been slightly sort of reluctant to push these to the fore, these weapon systems have been designed specifically with Russia in mind. Whenever we think about how much the United States spends on its military, it's thinking about two targets, China or Russia, or the USSR as it was before. And of course, that also means the actual installations. I mean, we saw the missile attack on the base in Sevastopol previously this week. And when you're watching something like that, you realize that it is being destroyed with missiles that were specifically designed for that building, not approximately for that building, because that will have been on a list drawn up by the US military a very long time ago. And of course, the Ukrainians know this. They know that the US has got an entire arsenal that is specifically designed to hit the Russians, and that's why they've wanted this for so long. And in some ways, it's very useful for the US because it means that they will now get to see live action firsthand whether or not all those tax dollars have actually been put to good use, whether or not these things are going to work. But as we all know, it's been a dreadful stalemate, this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. It hasn't really been able to deliver the sucker punch that they'd wanted. That can all change very quickly. That's the nature of this kind of warfare. It can, and obviously the Ukrainians will be hoping that this is the sort of game changer that delivers them their ability to push on towards Crimea. Yeah, I mean, that's the question, isn't it? They're getting tanks, they're getting aircraft eventually, they're getting the long-range missiles. Will this change the direction of the war, do you think?
Well, obviously, I'm no expert on this kind of warfare, but I'm afraid to say I don't feel terribly optimistic because of maths, really. The fact that Putin has an enormous number of young men who he can feed into his meat grinder, and although he would like to avoid conscription as far as possible, and in fact there is conscription from all kinds of parts of the former Soviet Union, but he's managing to keep the elite away from it at the moment. I think he's in there for the long haul, and I do think unfortunately, support for Ukraine is waning as costs mount. And when we see what happened with Poland this week, Poland has been incredibly supportive, and they have fallen out over a grain deal with Russia, and as a result, they've said they're not going to supply more weapons. Well, Poland was one of Ukraine's closest allies. So obviously, I hope that Ukraine will win. I hope that Western support will continue, and I hope that these fancy-schmancy, extremely expensive weapons will turn the tide. But I don't think that Ukrainian determination on its own and Zelensky's charisma on its own and his ability to win support of leaders, I don't think that's going to be enough. I think it's going to take more than that.
OK, all right, let's turn our attention to events back at home once again. I was wondering if there's going to be a big Russell Brand exclusive again in the papers. It doesn't seem to appear to be there, certainly from the front pages I've seen. But the Sunday Times, Benedict, concentrating on the fate of former BBC bosses, because I suppose the big question now is, did management at the BBC almost turn a blind eye? They need the talent, they need the audiences that these names bring in, and are they prepared to sort of turn a blind eye to certain behaviours?
It's a familiar story, isn't it? Given large organisations like the BBC in particular, not wanting to sort of necessarily equate Russell Brand with people who also worked at the BBC and were found to have committed or behaved in an appalling way. But to say that there clearly in certain organisations, certainly in the past, certain people were allowed to get away with certain behaviours because of their star, because of their aura, because they were worth money to things like the BBC. And it is always going to be that question, actually, how much of this was actually known? Because, this has all been sort of drip-fed, if nothing else, through Russell Brand's own comedy routines, where he sort of alludes to this sort of behaviour, and everybody at the time laughed. And it's that sort of hiding in plain sight, to use that slightly nasty expression again. Was it hiding in plain sight? Were there people who turned a blind eye to it? This is what I think. Given that this is the BBC, this is the this is the licence fee payer that these people have to answer to. we do need to know, actually, were concerns raised? Were there sort of internal reports made? Were people told not to pursue lines of inquiry? Or was it actually just a complete free-for-all and nobody actually believed that he was behaving in a particularly bad way? You know, transparency is the most important thing here, I think, for the BBC, given what has gone on before.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get your thoughts on this in the next hour, if that's all right, Christina. Thank you both very much. And we're going to finish with a look at the weather.